Good evening. I'm Scott Rothkopf, the Alice Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight to what I'm sure will be an incredible conversation about this biennial. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that we are on Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people, and I just want to reinforce how important it is that the Whitney continues to acknowledge the ongoing existence of Indigenous peoples in our communities and also throughout the diaspora. And actually, that may be a topic that surfaces tonight in this discussion, because certainly the curators have done an incredible job of trying to foreground Indigenous voices in this show. I am so honored and thrilled that this should be the first biennial that occurred during my time as director of this museum. I've been here now since 2009, almost 15 years, and I've seen every biennial since 1997 when I was a student in college and I convinced my school newspaper to let me review the show. And I can say each one teaches me something new, and I can also say that this one is among the most extraordinary that I can remember having seen. The show has been curated with such care, such specificity, such visual and conceptual sophistication and discipline and rigor, even while it brims with life. And I'm just really grateful to the two curators, Chrissie and Meg, and the entire team at the Whitney Museum who worked to make such a powerful and important show come to life. I think it is a show that to some degree maybe is not even as powerful at first blush as people come to realize. It's a bit of a slow burn. It's a show that takes some thought, some attention, some sensitivity from the viewer, and I'm really looking forward to how we address that. I will now introduce our three speakers very briefly. I'm not going to do the whole CVs. Chrissie Iles is our Anne and Joel Ehrenkranz curator at the Whitney Museum and a longtime colleague and friend of mine. She is responsible for our film and video and moving image collection at the museum. And importantly, I think for this conversation, I'll make sure I get my dates right, was the co-curator of the 2004 and 2006 Whitney Biennials, and she curated the film section of the 2002 Whitney Biennial. So to have curated 3 Whitney Biennials is rare in today's terms, although it was more common in olden days when people and teams of Whitney curators often curated them successively, one after the other. I don't know this for a fact, but I believe our colleague Barbara Haskell has curated even more than 3 or been on more teams than that. But it'll be interesting for Chrissie to reflect a little bit on what it's like to return to this incredible series that is the biennial. She, of course, has curated so many landmark exhibitions like Into the Light and Dreamlands, her 2 very important surveys about cinema and video art in galleries, and she's most recently also curated incredible focused exhibitions on artists like Colleen Smith and Alan Michelson here in our new building. I also want to welcome Meg Onli, who is curator at large at the Whitney Museum. At large because she's often on the west coast of this country, but we also like having her around a lot during the biennial. Onli was previously the co-director and curator at the Underground Museum in Los Angeles, and before that she was associate curator at the ICA in Philadelphia, where she curated many acclaimed exhibitions and projects. I think most recently among them Jessica Vaughn's show and also the incredible Ulysses Jenkins survey, which actually toured across this country and taught so many of us about a figure who actually I first learned from Chrissie. So it's perfect to have the two of you there together. I want to mention that in addition to this show, Meg's second Whitney show is already in the works, which is the first retrospective in New York City of the artist Roy Lichtenstein that she is co-curating with the artist Alex DeCorte and me, and we're really excited about that show coming in the fall of 2026. Finally, I want to welcome our outside guest who very generously agreed to lead this conversation, Deana Haggag. She's an arts administrator, cultural worker, and strategic advisor, and she is currently a program officer in arts and culture at the Mellon Foundation, which has been an incredible supporter, not just of the Whitney, but of the cultural conversation throughout our entire field, not just of art, but certainly beyond. Prior to joining Mellon, Deana was the president and CEO of United States Artists, a national arts funding organization based in Chicago, and during her tenure, they did so much to grow their support of artists. I think most notably or memorably for me was a $25 million COVID-19 emergency fund that was so important at that time, as well as a Disabilities Futures Initiative. She has also served as executive director of the Contemporary, a nomadic and non-collecting art museum in Baltimore. And more than that, she's just been a great friend and interlocutor to me on a number of intense and interesting moments in my life in this space, let's call it. It's great that we have partners and friends like Deana on the kind of funding and foundation side, the philanthropic arm at a place like Mellon, that really helps us collaborate to make possible our dreams in this this field, and to do the kind of work that we do. So thank you, Deana, for leading this conversation. Thank you, Chrissie and Meg, for everything you do, for everyone in the art community, but especially for the Whitney. I'm really so happy about this show. I'm so proud to work with you, and I appreciate you both so much. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just by way of wayfinding, we'll probably chit-chat here for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll leave some room at the end for questions. So please save them if you have them. I think to get started, I do want to share that I was invited to do this about 2 months ago. And when I said yes, I kind of got immediately nervous because I didn't know where we would be in the world by today, May 1st, given, I think, the last several years we've all experienced together, and most especially the last 6 months. And then last week when we were talking, when we were sort of prepping for this, Chrissie, Meg, and I remember feeling like, oh, I kept saying it during our call, well, let's see where we are by next Wednesday. And I share all of that because I think for the first time ever, it felt really embodied of what it must feel like to curate the Whitney Biennial, that you spent all this time prepping for a show, and then it's pens down, and you have no idea what the state of the world will be when it opens, and how people will interpret the thing you've spent the better part of 2 years making. And so I think to get started, I actually want to open up a little bit about the process of making the show. I know Meg well from past lives. I've gotten to know Chrissie. I've never had such an inside view into what it takes to make the biennial, and I really want to talk a little bit about, quite literally, when did you start? How long did it take? And sort of that process leading up to the opening.
Yeah. Thank you, Deana. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Meg, for saying yes to doing this biennial, because when Scott invited me to curate the biennial, Scott said, well, who would you like to curate it with? And I said, Meg only. And Scott said, well, what happens if Meg's not available? I said, I don't know. Meg's the only one I want. And so, the process, it's an interesting question, because when did we start? We started when Meg said yes, which was about October 2022. But the process, in terms of our individual ways of thinking, in a way, the process that you could say came into play before we even thought about the biennial as a project, kind of started before that, a long time before that. So in terms of the actual process of making the show, October 22, so 11 months, was the starting point. But it's so much thinking that it's very cumulative. So you bring everything to a project like this that you've thought about, and all the reading and everything way before that. So the reason I'm mentioning that in that sort of slightly clumsy preamble is that I've been reflecting on that ever since that question came up as a possible starting point. And the specifics of curating this show are very, very rapid. You have to do a lot of studio visits in a very short space of time. You have to travel the country. We looked at a number of major group shows by our colleagues in America and beyond. And so that process of traveling and discussing on the road means that you have to synthesize a lot of ideas and a lot of information very quickly, but you also have to listen. And I would say one thing that really determined our process was that process of listening, and listening to the artists, whether they seemed like a contender for the show, or whether they were ready or not. Listening was really the key.
Thank you, Deana. Thank you, Chrissie. Thank you, Scott. And I also just want to say thank you so much to Beatrice, who's one of our assistants, who's gotten us here, as well to Megan, Andy, everyone from the programming and education department. I also saw Angela back there. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, everyone who worked on the show that's actually here that I can see. Maybe just to add that, yeah, it's such a short timeline. It's about 11 months. We were done in September of 2023. And Chrissie and I started in Los Angeles, where I was living, and we wrote just a really long list of artists. It was about 300 artists. We added some artists to that list, but it was the primary list that we were really working from. And what we kind of said to ourselves is, actually I should say that maybe one of my favorite process of working on the biennial is you actually get to interview past biennial curators. And so, you interview Thelma, who tells you don't read the press, which I love, keeps you sane. I remember talking to Elizabeth Sussman and Jay about how much the landscape has shifted. Talked to, Jane and Rue and Mia Locks, and I mean, just everyone that you can kind of get your hands on, you will talk to and get a sense of the biennial. And a couple things came up. I remember thinking from Henrietta Holdish said, most people aren't going to like it anyway, so curate the show that you really want to curate. That was really important. Of course, Thelma's don't read the press. And I think for us, we had these questions with Mia Locks around whether you can make a thematic show out of this. Both Chrissie and I are really interested in thematics, what it means to bring a group of artists together. And we did set a couple guidelines pretty early. We thought we wanted fewer artists than usual. We landed on 44 in the galleries, 71 with the robust film and performance program. We wanted to give more space to artists in the sense of huge installations that we are really interested in. And we also said, we majorly have curated. I think it's like 97% have never been in a Whitney Biennial before. There's 3 who have returned. So we set out some of these goals for ourselves. And the first 2 months we said, we have no idea what this show's gonna be. We're just gonna listen to artists and get a sense of, what they're thinking, what they're talking about. As a young curator, I was really nervous. And I have to say, I think I really found my confidence working with you on this project, because you just have to trust that a show will get done. And that the catalog is going to drive a ton of those things. But those were some of the kind of, the biennial is something that's kind of amazing. And I thank you, Scott, for just kind of opening it up for us. Like, this show can be anything that you kind of want it to be. And Chrissie and I really thought about, what it meant to work with artists, support them. And maybe last thing I'll say is, when you're working with artists, it also means you're caring for artists. You're trying to see to their needs. I see a lot of curators shaking their heads. Working with lots of curators puts a strain on both you as well as the artist. And so we really said to ourselves, we're each holding about 20 artists. And does that feel as if we can meet their needs and have regular conversations with them and check in? And so that also felt really important to think through ideas of care. And obviously tons of travel. I did 100 flights on preparing for the show, which is just nuts.
So I did read the press. Obsessively. I've never read anything more obsessively.
You and my partner, thank
yeah,
you.
I think basically every word. And I have some thoughts actually about where the press decided to take this, if it's okay to get into a little bit.
Be gentle.
I think the thing is, I have had to think a lot about the work in the show. I've had to not strain. I have yet to see a biennial, if I can say something really sensate, I have yet to see a biennial that does not have a sensational moment or does not rely on spectacle in some way, at least in the few I've gotten to see over the course of my life. And it was actually really interesting to walk through a biennial and not be given that moment, and to have to arrive at each of the works and to have to really see something that's hung so intimately. And it made me really curious about the press's reaction to the show, specifically this being the first biennial to mount or to be made post-2020. And what I perceive to be a real white rage in the world right now about not being able to render our bodies legibly. And I feel like I can't remember the last time I've been in a biennial that had so little figuration that forced me to really think about what these artists were trying to say. And if it's okay, I want to read one part of the wall text that I have not been able to sort of leave, like get out of my head, about sort of some of the responses to really struggling with the show. Julia Phillips, in her work, which I loved in the show, Julia did the Sculptural Works Friends, where there's just some parts of a body that you can see sort of casted. By showing the body in fragments, I am hinting at a potential presence. Letting viewers fill in the blanks, hopefully, allows them to adjust the work to fit their own realities and their own imaginations. And I'm curious about what it means to be in a landscape where people don't bring their own reality or their imagination to a work, that they need it rendered so literally. And I want to know, like, were those conscious choices to think about figuration? It's the body, it is present all over the show, top to bottom. And how did you get there?
Thank you. It's a very thoughtful question. Yeah, the show's totally about the body. It is very much from the early conversations we had. One thing I forgot to say that we laid out very early on was that we didn't want to have any spectacle of death. That was like a very early thing. And I think, I see lots of people, again, shaking their head. It's not a controversial turn today. We've had lots of conversations about this. We've talked about it in art history. What does it mean, in particular for me, to have Black and brown death as a spectacle? I think, it's something that my work has never tracked really within. I don't think your work has really tracked within. It's something that media has fodder for and circulates and loves perpetuating these ideas. And early into our conversations, we noticed a lot of artists were talking about the body, the implied body, embodiment, and also a bit of anxiety about what does it mean to be representative of a group of people. And so I remember having a conversation with Lotus King in an early studio visit, and we were just talking about what are the ways in which Lotus sort of gets rendered as this monolith, for her people. And I think about it a lot for myself, being queer, being masculine presenting, being Black, like, I'm really interested in the multidimensionality of a person, and I think you're really seeing that in this show and how artists are thinking about it. I remember, Jay came to us afterwards and said, "This is the first time I really felt like I wasn't just a what's the word I'm thinking of? I wasn't a token in this show." And that was really moving to me, to be like, yeah, these are a lot of queer people, a lot of trans people, a lot of people of color, a lot of AFAB people, which I'm realizing not everyone knows is assigned female at birth. And, I think we track through some of these ideas. It's really hard to group this many artists in a show under a theme. I'm still questioning of whether you can fully do that or not. But we use the idea that, within the United States, lots of people have not been considered real or have been considered subhuman within this country. I mean, it's just a fact. It's been interesting to see people push back on that, but I'm like, it's a fact. I can point you to an amazing person sitting here, Zakiya Mon-Jackson, who's written a book about it. Sorry, baby, I had to embarrass you. But it's one of those things that what happens when we kind of have, and I guess I thought we could have an initial understanding of walking into that space. And you're seeing right here, seeing P staff as one of the entry works, which is quite an aggressive work, but P themselves is in a moment of retreat. And being able to sort of see this, to be on view, to protect oneself, I think was really important for us.
Yes, and also, it's interesting to think of P's installation and then to think of Carmen's relation to P's next door, Carmen Winant's The Last Safe Abortion piece. And, things that people have mentioned to us about the space of the show are really focused on the amount of space we've given the artist, but also the viewers and the visitors to the show. So the body also includes the body of the viewer and the ways in which the viewer is allowed to kind of just occupy space. And the idea of coming out of the pandemic, coming out of people being in restricted and confined spaces into the outside world again in a way that doesn't feel dangerous. It's like, but does it? To whom? And so all these questions of this idea of so-called return to normal. What's normal? for very many people in the United States and beyond. That normality is hell in different ways. And so as you move through the show, what kind of space are you creating for people to be in each room, but also moving between rooms, between pieces, being able to actually be present, to put their phones down, to actually look and experience also the works in a very haptic way. Many of the installations that Meg mentioned are very haptic for a reason. They surround you, not again in a spectacularized way, but in a way that feels very corporeal. So I should be looking at you. I'm just trying to think through this question, also looking at the works on the screen and the ways in which we encounter the body, never literally, never directly. And so to kind of also think about our own bodies as we're doing that, whether you're lying on the floor in Tina Zavitsanos' installation and feeling literally the vibrations of Tina's voice, or surrounded by the light in P's room, and P talks about curdling that yellow light. And there's a real politic around that room and the entire, the three elements of it. And so that sense of who the viewers are experiencing the show and how we relate to our bodies, as well as how the different artists relating to each other's ideas through the body in this very indirect way, also relates to architecture. And that was one of the through lines of the show that we kept seeing in the studio visits, was the relationship of the body to architecture, the relationship of the body to architecture as a psychological space, as a psychoanalytical space. And psychoanalysis kept coming up again and again in our visits as something artists were really engaged in, either rereading it, in some cases like Sondra Perry-Sondra was becoming a psychoanalyst. And so that relationship between the body and also the unconscious, the psyche, and what that meant became super important as well.
I think also just one more thing to add. When you're doing studio visits with artists, we're looking at their bookshelves. We're talking about what they're reading. You're really getting a sense of what are people thinking about. And I saw David Getze recently seeing the show, and I said, their book Abstract Bodies is being referenced by artists all the time. That book is a decade years old. It's not a current book. I don't know if how many people have read it, but it came up a lot in our studio visits. And Abstract Bodies kind of rethinks 60s minimalism through a trans lens, and it was really important to some of the artists in the show. And so I think also for us, turning to one thing that you and I do is also turning to art history and turning to art history and some of the conversations that are happening and trying to play them out in space. And it's been interesting to see where maybe there hasn't been such a maybe a misreading of what that is, or like what happens when you're thinking through these complicated ideas and you're also being met with like sumptuous rooms. Like these are beautiful space. You and I both believe in, I hate to say it, beauty. It's a complicated thing to say, but a lot of the install is a classical install. It's sight lines for days. And so for me, I'm always like, when people complain about the show, I'm just like, but it looks so good. I'm like, it looks so good. And I think we were smart, but at the baseline, I'm like, God, it just feels amazing when you're in that space. And it's a challenge working at that scale. Every artist is our first studio visit with Mary Kelly, when we invited her, she's like, okay, so I'm making a 30-foot piece. Like every artist told us they were making something huge, 8x10 works. I mean, just huge pieces that we could accommodate. And even thinking of Turquoise Dyson's piece, I mean, that piece is imposing and huge and took 6 weeks to install. And Turquoise is constantly in this kind of like liquid form of thinking what this piece could be. And so for me, it's also thinking about the choreography of the space. And so many artists are choreographers in the show, or trained dancers. Suzanne Jackson, right now on screen, was a trained dancer.
Actually, while we're on Suzanne, and while you're mentioning Getze's piece, there are quite a few elders in the show that really like anchor it, I feel. And the one thing I really walked away from, at least my first viewing feeling, is, oh, we've been having some of these conversations for a very, very, very long time. And can you speak a little bit to some of them and some of the themes that there are some artists that have passed in the show, and I feel like they've really left a lineage to other artists who have clearly picked that up and walked with it, and they are tributary to one another. But can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Totally. I mean, you know, the show's very relational. I don't know if it comes across if you don't know the artist, but the rooms we're seeing right here of Mary Kelly has taught Sharon Hayes has taught Carolyn Lazard. We're tracing lineages, either pedagogical lineages, there are friendships in this space, there are artists who are heroes to other artists. Yep. And one of the things that has struck me is, you know, conversations, let's say, I'm going to choose two of the elders. There's really 6 kind of matriarchs of the show. That's Pippa Garner, who's on this floor. Pippa Garner, Mary Kelly, Takako Yamaguchi, Mavis Pusey, Mary Lovelace O'Neill, and Harmony Hammond. I said Suzanne already, right?
No, but also
Suzanne. Okay, maybe there's 7. But some of the things that I've heard around ideas of abstraction and like where a politic lies is a critique that's been waged at literally all of these elder artists. Like Mary Lovelace O'Neill, who was part of the Black Power movement, you know, when she started making her Lamp Black series, people asked, well, what are you doing for the cause anymore? You're just painting abstract paintings. I think, you know, returning to Mavis Pusey's work, which, you know, really hasn't been seen by many people in years, bringing in Dejida, which is a work that was shown in the 1971 Whitney's Black Contemporary Art. That show was controversial within our own history as the Whitney, but it was controversial for 2 different reasons, and I recommend, so I'm going to give so many book recs while we're doing this talk, but I recommend Susan Kahn's Mounting Frustration. It's a fantastic book around that period, as well as Darby English's book, 1971. They're both great. I reference them all the time, but it looks at that 71 exhibition, and a lot of people were upset that the Whitney didn't have Black curators at the time. But what they were also upset about was that there was too much abstract art in the show, and they didn't think it was speaking to, you know, the moment and the time. And you can see the same thing with Harmony Hammond's work. And so it's been interesting just even seeing, I mean, Mary Kelly starts making works with dirty nappies. I mean, all of these works had their controversies at some point, and it's been interesting because it feels like old hat to them. All of them are just like, oh yeah, that critique's been waged and it's just going to continue to be waged, as if abstraction is separated from its own politic. But I also think, you know, there's lots of ways in which people are rendered as abstractions. There's lots of ways in which I think P. Staff's work is a great representation of that, of taking the nervous system and hanging it directly above you. I think there's also just lots of things of around visibility that it's not something that's distant and far from me. It's something that I'm thinking about. It's how I move through the world. Like, what does it mean to also not be read or to be read in abstract ways? Like, people live, these are like lived experience. These aren't just artists having, you know, ideas and exercising them. This is actually like their lived experience. Keon Williams talks a lot about that of, you know, what does it mean to be consumed by others outside their community in the gallery space? And so we really wanted to be sensitive to that. I think we were really tuned into kind of thinking about the artists and trying to think about best strategies for them to sort of combat that type of gaze.
Absolutely, and you know, one of the things that was very clear when, because we had, I think, 10 new commissions, one of the things that was very clear once all the work was up was the way in which certain artists from a younger generation like Charisse Paulina Weston and Caroline Lazard, and then, of course, Turquoise, and also what Eddie Aparicio and P. Staff, is the way in which a younger generation is rethinking those ideas from the 60s. I mean, you know, the Whitney's long relationship with fugitive sculpture is very much continued in the work of Eddie, but with a politic that wasn't, was completely different at the time, and that sort of rethinking also those minimalist and post-minimalist arguments around sculpture is something that is becoming clearer and clearer as the show settles into itself, and you see the relationships between the conversation Caroline Lazard is having with Robert Morris and that period through the work, say, of David Getzi for us as curators is super interesting, and then the way in which that relates to Charisse and that relationship between sculpture and architecture, the opacity in Caro's medicine cabinets, where she's not showing us the contents of the cabinet. She's not allowing us to see inside the body, although Jay Fan is. And so all these interconnections across the floors are ones that you see as you progress through the different spaces. And then Eddie Apparicio's sculpture, which we just saw the two states of a few images ago. I mean, that really relates strongly to our anti-illusion show from 1969, the first sculpture for which was a massive cube of ice in front of the front door to the museum that just gradually melted over a period of days and weeks. And so this rethinking of those early ideas, I think, excuse me, you see also in the way in which a younger generation is engaging with that period and completely rethinking it. And then so to introduce these matriarchs into that discussion who have been working since then and are present in relation to the younger works, say Charisse and Mavis, is very powerful because it really draws out new readings for both artists. Sorry.
I think one of the reasons I wanted to kind of open on some of the press is I was like, oh man, we've been having these conversations. Like, why have we not caught up to what art history has been telling us now for decades and decades and decades about one's willingness to either make their body legible or to keep it opaque, one's willingness to share their politics on their own terms, and then a kind of critical framework that I am really worried can't hold it. Like, I am really worried that if people cannot tell what someone's body looks like from the work they make, that they are entitled to rage over it. And I feel like that was sort of seeping out of the show. And I think you all did such a beautiful job protecting what these artists were trying to say on their terms and not allowing it to be sort of foretold through a particular gaze. And a gaze, I think, that is, especially for the Whitney Biennial, the harshest spotlight in our field, right? Like a very harsh spotlight. And so I loved this show, and I really mean this so earnestly. I was so disappointed in so many of the people that wrote, and the critics that wrote about it. And I really felt like I want to live in a world where the critics know how to look at art.
Well, I think some of it, again, not having known a lot of it, but hearing from both you and Zakiya, I think some of it I've just been surprised by, like the transphobia and the racism. I think there's just been some things that feel blatant. Before the show even came out, I remember seeing a meme that was, what did they call us, the pronoun biennial? And, I remember someone being like, back in the day, we used to put mediums on this, and now we got pronouns. And I was like, from a standpoint for us, like, a lot of this was about trying to make sure we weren't misgendering artists and that artists weren't being misgendered in the press. And so part of me is also just kind of about who you keep your community with and who you're kind of thinking about as people, are out in the world. And the world is harsh. It's harsh to many of us. And so it's one of those things that you have to kind of let go and just kind of give it its space. But I also think, you mentioned 2020 as this turning point, and I think, we're having long conversations, about, let's say in 71, there's conversation about why the Whitney doesn't have Black curators. And then the huge turning point again in our history is thinking about the 93 biennial, in which you have Thelma Golden with Elizabeth Sussman and others, curating a show that then just feels as if to a group of people, it's not about art. And so you're also seeing some of these conversations kind of play out. And I'd be very curious to see how many of the press are queer, trans, people of color, disabled people, or are those your company that you're friends with? And so for me, it's also thinking about like all of these things are being changed by the communities we're building, the institutions we're in, and the conversations we're having.
Yeah. I mean, I think also for me, one of the reasons I don't feel like I need to necessarily occupy any of those identities to demand that it be legible to me.
That's fair.
And I feel like, what does it mean to have grace? There's one moment, I don't remember where in the catalog, and I think, Meg, you name it, where we talk about how, for many people, the world has ended before.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what is it that the apocalypse is not a place we're arriving, but it's a condition we're sort of always in, right? It is the apocalypse in Gaza. It is the apocalypse in the Congo. It is the apocalypse in Sudan right now. For some of those people, we are the apocalypse. Like, we have literally embedded it on them. And to not have the grace to assume that there are violences you can never, ever hold in your body. And it is okay to still try to make sense of a work and walk. And I think maybe by not giving us a sensational moment, you force us all into that frame to really try to like sit with these works and again imagine how they fit into our own realities and imaginations. And I'm grateful for that. And I think I wanted to see a response to it. And to Scott's point about it being a slow burn, like it took me time to really understand Eddie's piece, like really sat with it and like watching it move. So I'm grateful for it. Can I turn to like a totally different question, just because he's one of my favorite artists? Tell me about working with Isaac Julian. I just must know. I must know.
I was asked this yesterday.
Well, I've worked with Isaac for a long time. I've known him since we were both in our early 20s. We used to double date together back in London and go to the same clubs and stuff like that. So I followed
Wait, double
Isaac's-
date?
Yeah, they've been friends forever.
Yeah. So, and go to clubs and everything. So I've seen Isaac, and through Derek Jum and everything, I've known Isaac for a very long time. We've been close for a very long time, but that's not why Isaac is in the show. Isaac's in the show because Isaac is the most extraordinary filmmaker and artist. And when we started talking about the show and about film, because film and video are very important to Meg and I both, and so I think everyone thought we were going to do the video biennial, if not the pronoun biennial, and we kind of have, and it was it. But we were so drawn to all these different mediums as well, and then we're thinking about film and video installations and how, as well as the film programs, and how those moving image works related to the other artists and works that we were thinking about. And the extraordinary thing about the installation in the biennial, it's 5 screens, 5 sculptures, 5 mylar screens on the walls, and 3 interweaving narratives. And this sense of the craft of filmmaking, which you see all the time in the film world, but the art world is very, the rigor isn't always there, let's say. But this craft, the filmmakers in the show, Madeline Hunter, Ehrlich too, really understand the craft of filmmaking. And this piece by Isaac really shows that. The different ways in which Isaac weaves not only the 3 narratives together, but also footage that he filmed with Bradford Young, mixed with footage from a 1971 film, You Hide Me, and the ways in which he collaborates with his actors, the way in which he addresses histories and what he calls unfinished modernisms, and then can really synthesize that in a space in such a way that you are moving through the screens and around them in relation to not only the static sculptures, but the moving figures within each screen. And the edits also of each film is, talk about choreography, it's just brilliant.
Yeah, there's something with Isaac that, when I started working on the biennial, I was really anxious, and I called Helen Molesworth, who we're both friends with, and I just asked her for some advice, and Helen said, I think what ruins a biennial is the unevenness of the work. She's like, I think sometimes it's really hard to keep the quality really up. And so I think you just have to go out there and get the best work possible and, try and put an idea and theme to it. And I think there's something about, once again, Statues Never Die. Chrissie and I had seen it in Philadelphia. We then each saw it at the Tate. I did not know Isaac beforehand, a huge fan. And I think there's something when you work with an artist that has that type of precision. And it's not performative. It's like the eye of, he walked in and said, I want those to be inky blacks. I don't know the technical term, but they need to be blacker. They need to be black like a silver gelatin photo. Really getting it there. And we focused on one of the screens. We weren't doing major tweaks. These are tiny things. But it was about the precision of that work to I'm not one that am artists change the world in all these ways and they're these amazing people. I'm artists are people. But there are some artists that you're in front of where you're the eye that you have is so honed that it's really inspiring to be around, and it elevates everything else. And so Isaac was a huge fan of Suzanne Jackson. And so we made sure that the two of them had a chance to meet. I mean, I think almost all the artists wanted to stand in line and meet Isaac Julian. And I remember during the artist opening, Isaac was sitting in the back with the singer Alice Smith behind one of the screens. And Diane, Madeline, I think it was Lahia, and maybe Clarissa was there as a group of the younger filmmakers and video makers. They were on the other side just being like, oh my God, this piece is so good. But they didn't know Isaac was sitting back there. And I think it's just, you know, the thing that I keep joking when I'm touring this show, I'm like, God, I love this work. I'm like, it's not often you get to tour a show that you've done that you're like, man, I really love so many of these pieces. Pieces turn out uneven. Sometimes you have to learn a work. And I think for me, Isaac's piece is just, it's extraordinary. It really is, it's absolutely arresting. And it's one of those pieces that I tell people, if you're just going to see one thing, I really recommend being in that room.
The other thing is thinking about the audience or audiences for the show. The kind words you've said about the biennial, the feedback we are getting from peers, from artists, and the rigor of the show, the conceptual rigor, we hope, of the show, is layered with the general public, who I love watching discover this work for the first time. So if you come in on a Friday night, I think we had 8,000 people a couple of Fridays ago, and you just sit there and just watch everyone come in, the general public who know maybe nothing about art or very little, and they're just navigating this and really being so curious and so delighted to see them walk into these different rooms, not just Isaac, but all of them, really tells you a lot about the different layers through which you can talk about the different works and their relationships to each other, but also the space you're in. Because one of the other themes in the show that was very important to us that we really developed was sonic space, was the idea of sound. And sound is something that's usually a problem in a museum. It's like, oh, sound, as though it's interrupting some kind of contemplation that it requires total silence. Now, some experiences do require total silence. In a biennial, that's, of course, almost impossible. But, you know, what we thought about was sonic space and the body, sonic space and the voice. And the sound that you hear in the rooms is designed so that when you're in the room, you can really hear it very clearly, or right under Sharon Hayes speakers, for example. But when you're in a sort of in-between space between one room and another, you can hear an echo of it. You can hear maybe an overlapping. And that overlapping is something we were interested in when we invited Jerome Ellis to score the exhibition. And the exhibition, of course, had to be fully installed for Jerome to do that, which they now have and are working on it right now. But Jerome was really interested in the possibility of collaborating with the sound from some of the rooms and what that would mean, and also Holland Andrew's sound installation they made for the stairwell. And Jerome approaching that challenge or invitation by going to the artist and talking about how to maybe work with some of those sounds is something also that very interesting in relation to collaboration, to the dissonant chorus that Ligia Lewis talks about, to the idea of how you create the presence of the body, again, without necessarily a physical presence, and what that means. And I think Isaac's piece deals so much with the sculptural presence of the body, the physical presence of the viewers in relation to the presence of the bodies on the screens. And then you hear these echoes and these further echoes, the further and further you get away from one room and the nearer you get to another. And so that's something that's really intuitive when we were making the layout of the show and thinking about that.
Tell me a little bit, especially while we're on the sonic space, about Nikita's piece.
It's one of my favorite pieces.
Mine too. I could spend a lot of time.
I love, it's called Tempo Rubato, Stolen Time.
Yeah.
And it was funny when we talked to Nikita at first about, most of the artists were like, let's have a conversation about what we're going to make, or what you're going to make. Freudian slip as a curator.
You heard it here first, folks.
And Nikita said, I'm making this piece with a player piano. And we're like, oh, okay, well, do you want to talk about anything else? And they're like, no. And it was just like, no conversation. I'm making this work. And we were just like, okay, like, Nikita really knows what they want to make. We're going to trust them on this. And oh my God, the piece just blew me away. I mean, it just, installing it, being in the other room, it was just so haunting. If anyone hasn't seen that work yet, it's a 100-year-old player piano that has been rendered silent. Nikita is very interested in ideas of the history of Black performers. I always mention their work Tiny Dancer, which is recently acquired by the Tate, which thinks about Tina Turner's legs. And within this, you're seeing a non-present pianist. And all the keys have been rendered silent, so you're just hearing the ghost keys being played of 3 or 4 songs that have not been named. And thinking about these ideas of sampling, interpolation, all of these complicated places we have found ourselves in with a history of stealing music from others, and particularly stealing music from Black musicians. And so they're worked with an ASCAP lawyer, and they really wanted to see, could a gesture alone be something that could be copywritten? And I'm really interested in these ideas of property, who can own property, who's been considered property, and the work just kind of hits on all of that while still just having this stunning and beautiful space. There's haptic benches in the back, as well as a lighting design that kind of crescendos and goes back. I've heard from some piano players that sometimes 12 keys are held down, and so also playing with these ideas of technology and when the hand is present within them. Yeah, I love that piece. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where I spent the most time.
Yeah.
But the piece that broke my brain is Diane's film, where I really want to hit, like, even better than the real thing, where there are moments in Diane's film where I can't tell which reality I'm placed in, and I think does such a tremendous job. And for me, it felt foiled a little bit to what was happening in Isaac's film. Like, there's just a different place now, where I feel like so much of what we're living through is encapsulated in that project. Can you speak a little bit about that film?
Yeah, I mean, so Diane's film is called In Her Time, brackets Iris's version, and it was commissioned by the Rockma Museum in Shanghai in China. And the film, inside this installation that's meant to evoke part of the soundstage that the film was made on, it's one of the biggest sound stages in the world in China, really takes the central character, Iris, as she is playing a role in a film about the Nanking Massacre in 1930s China. By the Japanese army, and the rape of the women there. And so Iris is talking about her experience of being the actress who's playing the main character in the film, and the trauma of reliving that terrible moment, and what it means to be reliving that trauma, and this relationship between, again, reality and fiction, and then the physical space also of the gallery, the big daybed which people lie on to watch, versions of which appear in the film. There are these layers, as you say, of those historical moments relived in the present, what that means. That's something that we see recurring throughout the show in a number of different works that deal with these larger arcs of history, pretty much all in the film rooms. And so that very, very layered, nuanced structure, again, this rigor of the structure and the craft of filmmaking is something that's very striking in that piece.
I mean, I think it made me feel like so much of what we're living through feels like a reenactment right now. And I can't quite place my body in the reality of what's happening. And then also this idea that, like, all history is like a re-traumatization of a thing you already know. And so, like, something about watching her, like, place herself in and out of the frame of that, I think really felt, I could see the threads in so many of the other works. How does it feel to open the show in a crumbling democracy on a burning planet?
You know, it's funny, when we were prepping for the show, I read every catalog, and I had all of them from like '89, and then Adam sent me a bunch of them, and I was like, man, the biennial is just tracing the fall of America. Every single catalog, it's like, America is in a horrible place, and I was like, every single one you kind of read, and you're like, you know, not 1932, because it only lists the artworks, but as soon as we started having essays, every 2 years, it feels like we're in the height of a crisis that is unlike any other. And there's something when you look, Rue Rijeko actually talks about that in her essay in 2019. She says what happens when you're curating something that in every iteration, they think things can't get worse. And then the next curators have to step up and answer what's gotten worse, you know? And part of it is, as you started with the conversation, is how much can you capture within the time of curating? You know, we ended curating the show in September. Like, the book was done, the checklist was done, you know, we're moving forward, and that's all before the moment of October 7th. And so, you know, it's one of those things where it's so hard. We talked about, like, what do we want to address in this show? What are the things, because the Ukraine war isn't addressed either. Like, there's multiple things that aren't addressed, and it was hard to make some of those selections, because oftentimes you're given a set of objects that you're trying to tell a story with. And of course, you know, we're meeting with certain artists, and we're trying to tell the story with that. And then sometimes you have an artist who decides that they also want to have a conversation about something in the moment. And so having someone like Damien make a piece that, you know, that we weren't aware of, but speaks to this exact moment at the right time, it was surprising. Like, I definitely didn't see it in there, but I also am like, I think it's the right work, you know?
It's also something that occurs to me, which is there are 300 biennials in the world, of which this is one. And all the other biennials, right from the beginning, have their they're named after the city they're in. The Venice Biennale, Sao Paulo Biennale, the Berlin Biennial, you know, the Lyon Biennial, the Shanghai, Sharjah, you know, every single biennial, Guangzhou. This is the Whitney Biennial. So this isn't named after, it's not the New York Biennial, it's the Whitney Biennial. So the Whitney Biennial is unique in being named for the institution it takes place in, and none of the other biennials pretty much take place within it or are so enmeshed in the institution. And what's also interesting is, and the reason I say that is that all the other biennials that I just mentioned were created out of a sort of almost recuperative desire to, in response to a crisis. So, you know, Documenta after the end of World War II, you know, of which the Berlin Biennial becomes something that's really dealing with post-1989, and every single Berlin Biennial ends up talking about the war, and then 1989 in some shape or form. The Guangzhou Biennial, created after, you know, after the massacre there and with the emergence of democracy, you know, every single biennial has that connection to trauma, has that connection to a historical moment that the biennial is trying to sort of heal in some way. The Whitney is different, so it's almost as though the traumas in America and the histories and the dramas that are played out in America, and I have to say as a European, it happens in America in this very intense way that's a real, like, America has led the field in civil rights, in feminism. There's so much where everyone is taking America's lead. So it's interesting that whilst all those other biennials around the world are kind of created out of those moments, it's like the Whitney Biennial sort of, you know, not stages those moments, but talks about those moments within the place rather than coming out of that place, if you know what I mean.
I mean, I think of it so much as like the quintessential American biennial, right? And I think for me, it's like, how do people in this country reckon with one another? And I feel like that remains, like, at least the ones I've seen in real life, in person. It's like, oh, this is just a story of how we do this, how we are the dissonant chorus, sort of to head back to Ligo's quote. But what a wild place we live. I think we are going to open up to a few questions. I'm going to ask Chrissie and Meg for any closing thoughts before we do that. But just a note, we're going to take a couple of questions at a time to try to move through as many of them as possible. So if you have one, please raise your hand or holler, whatever's most comfortable for you. Any burning regret, anything on the record, to the people far into... well, because one thing I love about this book and one thing I love about this biennial is that we get to study them. And I just have to imagine that we are really, truly living in some of the darkest times of my lifetime, and that someone is going to stumble on this catalog or stumble on this talk. So no pressure. But if there's anything you want to say for the archive of this, I would like to say that I have never heard artists talk about how they were treated better. And I really am actually curious about smaller shows that give artists more space, what that does for artists. So on the record, I would like to say that in a time where we go big and that it was really nice to sit with 44 artists in a space and to feel like I could look at each of them, really, truly, even if I didn't understand them. And that didn't make me feel any rage or violence towards them. And I appreciate that you gave them that space.
Thank you, Deana.
Okay, yes.
I'm like, what? The pressure here. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I've always wanted to do a Whitney Biennial. I've always wanted to do this show. And so I'm very thankful to Chrissie to inviting me and to Scott. It is really challenging. And it's something, since I became a curator, I have had a lot harder time critiquing shows because I've realized that there are so many factors that go into making a show. Like sometimes I'm like, this group show should have had this work. And how could they not know that? And it's like, well, it's probably they do know that. And either, they couldn't get the loan, or maybe that artist was like a jerk to you or your friends, or there's so many different ways that kind of make shows. And so for me, I apologized to Mia Locks when I started working on this show, and I said I was really, really hard on you. And Mia's one of my favorite people and supported me throughout this, and I just said, I'm really sorry. I had a really different idea of what this was, or how you go about this, or what it means, and to work so quickly and to be under such a spotlight has been really weird. It's really alarming and different. And I know you've done this for, a long time, but it's it is interesting. The Whitney is very watched. We're an institution that people look to. And I think one of the things I love about the biennial is I think it's a place to create discourse. And I feel really proud of the discourse that we created around the show. I think we moved with as much, care for ourselves and the artists, but I think more importantly, the team that we work with. You work with an amazing group of people here. These are people who have worked on numerous biennials, can solve any problem. It is, are you getting teary-eyed? No. It's one of those things where, you work with such talented people and they all come together and, you put the show together in 6 weeks. It's grueling. To put a show together like that in 6 weeks. And then you and I are off to the races of touring everyone. And so it's interesting just how all of that comes together. And I think, maybe my favorite thing someone has said about the show was something Scott said, which was, it's a very disciplined show. And I took that as a very high compliment. Of someone asked me the other day on a tour, why are there so many white walls? And I was like, well, that's the best way to look at sculpture, is to have a white wall with a sculpture in front of it. And so having the discipline to try and let the work stand out and sing and be seen. And, one thing you and I did not say is, early on we said no artwork in hallways, no artwork in bathrooms, no artwork in interstitial spaces. We didn't want work in the lobby unless it was in the gallery. We did talk about that because Damien really wanted a piece there. But unless an artist wanted to be cited in those places, we really wanted to keep everything in the galleries. And I think we didn't want an artist to feel slighted about the space they were in. And I think, we did the best that we could to the artists that I feel like, really showed up and produced an amazing show.
I agree, they did. And, for the record, maybe I'll go back to my essay. I remember last summer feeling really amazed at these two films that came out at the same time, Barbie and Oppenheimer. And, you know, it came when we were doing all this work on the body with artists and the fluidity of the body, the way, the materiality of the body, the trans body, unsafety. And then comes this hard plastic doll with blonde hair that can't even stand up on its own. And that really strange thing about Barbie where you give an adult doll to children. There's something very odd about Barbie, and then coming on the heels of Oppenheimer and Barbenheimer, I was thinking, what is off about this? And we'd been to New Mexico and I'd gone to Los Alamos and seen the atomic bomb museum and all that. And there was just something so profoundly nostalgic about that, that sort of looking back to that 1950s moment when America was so great, you know, apparently. And, you know, the nostalgia as a form of mourning, and the fact that, I remember you saying, Meg, we were talking about violence, you said, well, it's a white, you know, it's a kind of, there's no space for mourning in white America. And this anger and this violence and this deep nostalgia for the 1950s, and that nostalgia as mourning felt very much like a kind of, almost like gender panic or something that was really, the 20th century is slipping away. Every century begins in the next and ends, every century ends in the next century and then begins in the previous one. And it just feels like the 20th century is really slipping away now. It's like, you know, the tide receding, and there's a new century, and we're in it now. We're really in it. And that sense of a kind of fear and anxiety about so many of what that century represented. The 93 biennial is maybe so important for all the reasons we know, but also because it marks the beginning of the 21st century. It's the beginning of what we're in now. And so I think for me, the sort of huge, deep honor and pleasure of working with Meg and doing this show again has been to really see that very clearly, especially to see also the reactions, like, why is there space, or why is it so beautiful, or what does this mean, and the inability to read the body and all these things that we're talking about, or the transphobia and everything. It's because there's a massive shift occurring right now, geopolitically, but also, you know, culturally. And any time there's any discomfort with any exhibition, it means something. And that discomfort, in a way, controversy, it's too easy. Anyone could make a controversy. It's not that hard. What is work and what is a show without it? There's no controversy actually in the other 299 biennials around the world. Controversy is something, it's very local to New York, because I'm not sure people in LA even care about the Whitney controversies. It's really a red herring for me. To me, the real work and the shifts that are occurring are due to this, you know, this massive turn from one century to the next. So we try to kind of make a show that really brings artists together around all those questions. And it's a show about relations, interrelations with each other within this incredibly fractious moment.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Do we have questions from folks in the audience? Nobody wants to know about the double dates with Isaac Julian? I want to know about the double dates with Isaac Julian. We have one.
I'm curious about the relationship, or pulling at that strain of the relationship between abstraction and the show and the times that we live in today. Historically, I know the 2008 crisis was a result of taking tangible assets and turning them into derivatives, which is a process of abstraction. Similarly, today we have gender moving beyond a relationship with the physical body itself, but as a concept or with other identifiers. And I'm wondering if having the abstraction that's in the show, if you feel that thematically relates in some way to like how does the abstraction in the show, do you feel, relate to our time?
I mean, it's a huge question. I would argue that it's not gender that's like moving out at this moment. I think it's always been that way. And I think that's one of the things that you're seeing with abstraction within this show, that, you know, the artists that are working, you know, let's say even Suzanne Jackson, like has worked figuratively, you know, and some of her works begin as figures and then they become abstract over time. Mavis Pusey, at least in the work I've seen, none of her artwork was ever actually dealing with figures, except she used to be a fashion designer, so I've seen some of her fashion sketches, things like that. I don't know if it's directly reflective of our time. I think it's so much longer, and I think that's one of the challenges of the biennials. It's supposed to be the snapshot of this exact moment, but this exact moment is speaking back to years and years past and years of conversations that these artists have been having. I don't know if it's such a like figuration, abstraction, like hard camps. I do think, you know, part of curating is Chrissie and I have a certain taste, you know, like maybe this is something to be said, is that it's a show that both of us found, I'm blanking on the word, not concise. You and I had to curate in agreement, better word for agreement.
Consensus.
Thank you, consensus. You know, all the biennials are consensus shows in many ways. And so I don't know if we come in really being like, no to figurative painting. I mean, there is figurative painting in the show. Maya Rusnick has it. And hers is quite ethereal and it's floating away in these types of ways. But I will say, I think some of the things that the abstract artists are bringing in, let's say Harmony Hammond or Suzanne Jackson, it's their work with material. It's how they're thinking about their material that really draws, I think, both of us. Both of them are very important organizers in galleries in the 1970s and their relationship to other artists. I think there's lots of things that kind of tie to the importance of these artists and that they are also working in abstract ways. And they're all working in abstract ways very differently. You know, you're looking at really hard edge painting that's coming from Mavis Pusey, very, very graphic work, where Suzanne Jackson's works are literally kind of draping to the ground and they're changing over time. Harmony Hammond references the body throughout almost all of those paintings. So yeah, they're kind of abstract, but there's like, you know, 40 nipples on them at the same time, or there are these fleshy slits that happen that are like very vaginal. Like it's playing with some of these ideas, and I think a lot of the artists aren't necessarily in one camp or the other. It's just the way in which they're working is sort of blending and has a certain type of like fluidity to it. I don't know if fluidity is the right word. What do you think, Chrissie?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that was also very striking about what people started saying about the show was, oh, we're so sick of screens. We're so sick of, you know, during the pandemic, we would have Zooms all day and then go and then, what do you do, watch a movie on your same screen. And, you know, the boredom of the cold surface of the screen, where you're staring at whoever else is on the Zoom call and yourself for 7 hours a day, or whatever you're doing, or looking up images and reading, and everything was being very condensed into the screen, and it was very figurative. I mean, this is a very intensive relationship also then to social media that created community and was also, you know, very intense. And so 2020, fast forward to 2024, or when we were talking with the artists the end of 2022, we were really I think abstraction is also, it's you know, abstraction is, you know, several centuries old, obviously, but the way in which it configures here in the show is so bodily, as Meg mentioned, and so much also to do with a politic of the body and its relationship to physical and psychic space that you cannot experience without being there. I mean, even images of it don't even give you half the feeling of what it's like to be in the yellow light, listening to the buzzing of the electric netting, feeling the bits of it that have come unhooked or are very deliberately unhooked, but that sense that creates of danger and the possibility it might come down a bit further. All these things are very haptic. And so the way in which, for example, P uses the grid and inserts the trans body into that space in this abstract way is something that they've both been working with for a very long time, at least 10 years, but also along with the color yellow, but also has a particular resonance after the pandemic, going back into physical space. And the conventional exhibition involves just you going for a walk and you see one painting after another. Maybe you sit down and look at the painting for a bit longer. Maybe you walk around the sculpture. Installations, and many of these where abstraction occurs in the show are through installations. The physical space of the installation within a room is something that is, you don't experience that often. And so it's not simply abstraction, it's how the abstraction appears within the space and the haptics of that space, and what that means, and then what it means to go from, what does it mean to go from Lotus Kang, Charisse, Mavis Pussy, and Dora Budor. You know, those are all very, very psychological spaces, and that relationship to abstraction that occurs in each one occurs in very different ways for very different reasons.
Thank you. Megan, do we wrap or should we take one more? Do folks have any? All right, you can flood Chrissie at the end for the Isaac Julian stories. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Meg
Dee.
and Chrissie, and thank you to the Whitney.
Thank you.